So, with the November midterm elections in the rear view, we take a look back and say, what was right, what was wrong? Were the pollsters off? Joining us now is, our favorite numbers nerd, Pollster John Couvillion. What's happening, man? How you been?
Good morning. Thanks for having me on your show.
No, glad to have you on. I nerd out on this every time you're on, and
Yes.
so we're going to dive in. I want to start with this. The red wave was expected. The House flipped. The Senate did not. And it felt like there was nothing but disappointment in the wake. Now, you say in the column you posted up, in the conclusion, a poll is nothing but a snapshot in time.
Correct.
We'll work this backwards. Did the pollsters get it wrong, or did we all buy in on a snapshot too much?
I think you bought in on the snapshot too much.
Yeah.
More specifically, what I like to do whenever I look at polls, I don't look at any one poll. I like to look at what the polling community thinks. In other words, let's say you have 5 people polling the Arizona Senate race or the Georgia governor's race or whatnot. To me, the collective wisdom of those 5 people is more important than what any one person thinks. And so when I was following these polls going, starting late August, going all the way to November, it is correct that before the Roe ruling, like back in the spring of 2022, Republicans were doing quite well. I noticed after the Roe ruling, specifically in the month of August, things started to turn south for the Republicans. And while they started climbing back some in September and October, it wasn't like it was a strong movement like what we saw in 2010 or 2014. It was more like bits and pieces. And when I go back now and look at the data that counts, which is the last week before Election Day, in other words, November 1st to 8th, I started looking at the results from those races across the country, and lo and behold, it did not really show that Republicans were picking up very much, if anything. And so I think when you start looking at the actual data, as opposed to discounting a poll saying, well, this is a Democratic poll, or, this pollster is bad, or this or that, but you start looking at the data, you realize it was really a 50-50 election. And by the way, just like you talk about the false expectations leading up to this midterm, I would argue that you have people arguing on the other side equally incorrectly, like this was some great Democratic victory, when all that happened was it was a split decision.
Right. And this is one of the things that got lost in the overall results is when you look at the House or you look at the Senate and you see what the wins and losses are, you don't see the margin of victory. And a number of different districts where Democrats traditionally win with like 75% of the vote, they may have won with like 60. Right. Or where they win with 65% of the vote, it was down to the wire. Republicans still come up short, but that many more Republicans or that many more people voted Republican, even if they've missed the mark.
Correct. One of the interesting things, too, which also gets buried in all the kind of finger pointing and so forth after the election, believe it or not, Republicans did turn out.
Yeah.
So then that and by the way, for instance, here in Louisiana, no reporter has covered this, but I will right now. For the first time ever in Louisiana, more Republicans voted than Democrats. I've never seen that happen before.
Yeah.
So it was very much depending on which state you were in, it was either a very good Republican night or the Democrats did well, such as in Michigan, Pennsylvania, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the important takeaway here is that the polls were not, massively wrong. In a few selective cases, they were. And the problem is, in these close elections, even being off a couple points by the average person's definition means the poll failed. But being off by a few points in the world of polling, well, that's a natural occurrence because you have margin of error.
We're talking with John Couvillion from JMC Enterprises. He does a lot of polling heading into the races, and he gives a fantastic breakdown on the way back out. John, can we stick with that Roe v. Wade decision for just a minute?
Yes.
Were you able to garner enough information to find out why that particular ruling had such an effect on causing Republicans to maybe disengage or rallying Democrats on the other side?
So to start off, it was a fundamental messaging failure by the Republicans. In other words, all that happened by that ruling, it was a decentralization of the abortion decision to that of the states, which I would think conservatives would want, which is each state gets to decide what it thinks is an appropriate level of restrictions or permissions, as opposed to letting the federal government make one decision. But I think the other failure, besides not mentioning that fact, I do think Republicans pressed ahead too aggressively with regards to trying to restrict everything.
Okay.
And it did turn against the Republicans. I mean, a perfect example was that abortion referendum in Kansas back in August, where what happened was the Democrats managed to spin it as a freedom argument. And normally the freedom argument is on the Republican side, but the Democrats were making it look like it was a freedom of choice, and the Republicans didn't really have an effective counter argument. And one specific example I could tell you of the cost of the abortion issue on Republicans, there was some polling I was doing in Midwestern states. And when I was looking at the Republicans, they were underperforming the generic ballot test in these Republican suburban districts. When I started digging into the details and I saw that you had 10, 15, 20% Republican defections and independents were going 2-to-1 for Republicans, well, that's a very big problem there. In other words, you would think with inflation and the Biden administration's performance and so forth, you would expect to see independents leaning Republican number one, and number two, Republicans unanimously lining up behind their party.
Right.
So that, to me, besides what I saw happen in the immediate aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling, that illustrates kind of the, I guess, the missed ball that the Republicans had this election cycle.
I mean, you'd hate to take something as serious as Roe v. Wade. You hate to take something as serious as abortion and say you'd rather have the issue than the solution.
Yeah.
But it feels like the solution kind of left the Republicans kind of in the lurch, where there was a group that felt, okay, job's over with. I no longer have to be motivated to go to the polls.
Right.
But even some completely defecting.
And see, the interesting thing is I've done some abortion polling, and even in conservative areas of Louisiana, a lot of people make the mistake of assuming that people's opinions on abortion stops at the pro-life versus pro-choice self-definition. Mm-hmm. But when you start getting into, well, if regardless of if you think you're pro-life or pro-choice, do you think there should be exceptions, or do you think there should be just abortion regardless? Or
right.
That's where opinion gets more complex, and that's where I think the Republicans missed the ball. Is even people who describe themselves as pro-life, by and large, do favor some limited exceptions.
Yeah, yeah, and that's where, when applied in real life, that's politicians always miss the mark, to be sure. What were a few of your biggest surprises throughout this season?
I think the biggest surprise was, so on election night, there was 3 congressional districts in Virginia I was looking at that to me were a good gauge of how much of a Republican night it would be. Mm-hmm. The easiest one for Republicans to pick off, which is basically clearing the bar, they picked it off narrowly. But when I saw one of these narrowly Democratic districts stayed Democratic, I said, uh-oh, that's not going to be a good Republican night. Okay. Same thing happened when New Hampshire Senate race was called early for the Democrats.
Yeah.
And as the night went on, we weren't really seeing these massive Republican pickups. There were a lot of seats in the undecided column, so I was thinking, uh-oh, this brings back memories of 1998 when Republicans similarly were overconfident, thinking they would have a big night, but they spiked the ball on the Clinton impeachment, and it cost them politically. So that, to me, was the biggest surprise, was the inability to pick off any Democratic incumbent in the Senate and making minor gains in the House, but not like 30 or 40 seats.
Read your entire column about the kind of the postmortem on the election and where pollsters were. There's a word missing from your column, or maybe I just missed it individually. That word is Trump.
Ah, yes.
Everything leading up to was pro-Trump, anti-Trump. This is Trump's candidate. That's not Trump's candidate.
Right.
Everything revolved, the entire world revolved around Donald Trump and who he was backing. Within the breakdown, how much did that play, and how much of that was overplayed?
A lot.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a perfect example. The needle the Republicans have to thread is this. If you are overtly, basically sucking up to Trump, that is not what the voters are looking at. But voters similarly punish Republicans who are seen as having some kind of a personal animus against Trump. The Lynn Cheney loss, to me, was a perfect example of that.
Oh, my word, yes.
And the funny thing is, she turbocharged Democratic turnout and got quite a few of them to switch to Republicans so they could vote for her. Mm-hmm. Didn't matter. She lost overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
But I think, so it's a fine line the Republicans have to walk, because the thing is, people like Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, and Brian Kemp, the Republican governor of Georgia, they both did fine in their races, but they towed that careful line, which was, even though Trump didn't like them, they didn't make it a personal, in other words, they kept the Republican base united while not scaring off Democrats and independents.
When it comes down to it, though, and this isn't from your analysis, but when it comes down to it, though, that's what you want from your party. Mm-hmm. You want that level of independence and not that level of, like you said, sucking up.
Right.
But my biggest takeaway, though, was that of all the analysis that you did, it's all on a number of different substantial levels and not the cheap and easy headlines that we were fed throughout the campaign season.
Right. And I think the thing, too, is there's the accusations that several Republicans, pollsters, flooded the zone in mid to late October, making the numbers look rosier for the Republicans than was the case. What I saw, even though you did have some of those such polls, if you balance them against all the other pollsters out there, like I said, the results indicated it was going to be a 50-50 night, and I never saw the sharp turn towards the Republicans from June on.
Talk with John Couvillion from JMC Enterprises about the recap of the polling heading into the midterm elections. All right, John, nobody bats 1,000, so where did pollsters really miss the ball?
I would say the Arizona Senate race was one. I think making the Pennsylvania Senate race with Dr. Oz look like 50-50 was number two. Those, to me, the Senate races that were Nevada, that to me was exhibit A of where the Republicans really missed the ball, because polling averages showed the Republicans up by 3 when the Democrat won by 1. Mm-hmm. Nevada is a tough state to poll, but I think that what you got to do if you want to poll there is appreciate that the Democrats have a very active machine there, and they're using mail-in voting to squeeze every single vote they can.
Yeah.
What that means in plain terms is if you're polling in Nevada, you have to have a more generous allowance for what you think the Democratic turnout will be, as opposed to falsely creating these hopes that the Republicans will win, which is what I saw happen. And by the way, Republicans messed up in Nevada in 2010 as well, when they falsely thought that Harry Reid would lose.
Oh, wow. Forgot all about that. Mm-hmm. That's so the if I could get you, and we're going to run short on time, and I knew we would, but you're going back to your conclusion. A poll is a snapshot of public opinion over a period of time. Taking that snapshot involves a random representative sampling of voters.
Yes.
That sampling creates inherent error. Is the error growing just because of the nature of how we live as a populace? I mean, we don't have our home phone anymore.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. The thing is, pollsters, or those who are worth their salt, have long since learned to adjust to the world of cell phones. I mean, I had to recognize that reality back in 2015, and I almost have 0 landlines in my sample now.
Right.
So it's a case of recognizing changing conditions. But like I said, when I see misses that are in the 2, 3, or 4 point range in terms of falsely calling a race, that doesn't bother me as much as an extreme example here. There was that poll, I think it was ABC or CBS created it in Wisconsin back in 2020, showing Biden up by nearly 20 when in fact he only won by 1. That to me is a much more material polling error than getting a swing state wrong by 2 or 3 points.
Give me a grade real quick overall for pollsters. It's just on
I'd get B.
A B overall? It's about right.
Because I think the important thing for pollsters to understand, not only recognizing the world of cell phones, but also recognizing the fact that more and more people are choosing to vote before Election Day. So you need to take that into account as well. Even here in Louisiana, it was 30%.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was the last part that I didn't think we were going to get to. And that affects things as well. Your disengagement once you've done your duty is over with.
Right. But they still need to be counted in the poll because those are voters.
Yeah, absolutely. He is John Couvillion. The website is winwithjmc.com, winwithjmc.com, JMC Enterprises and JMC Analytics. We always appreciate the time and the insight, man. Fascinating stuff.
My pleasure.
We are